Here's the reading of pages 538 to 541. We're starting with Minding the Manor. There were few towns in Western Europe during the early Middle Ages. Most people lived in the countryside, often on a large estate called a manor. Every manor lay under the control of a lord. In fact, there was a saying in medieval times, no land without a lord, and no lord without land. Let's pay a visit to a manor. There's quite a bit to see. The lord's house, the village, and all the surrounding farmland. We'll start in the fields where the peasants of the manor spend much of their time. The first thing we notice is that the farmland around the village has been divided into three big fields. One field has been left to lie fallow, that is, it remains unplanted. In this field, the soil is exhausted from growing crops, and the Lord is giving it a rest for a year or two. In another field, he's growing wheat, and in third, barley. After harvest time, cattle, sheep, and horses can graze in these two fields. Many peasant families live on the manor. The Lord lets each family cultivate a little land in each field. They get plots laid out in long strips, which are easiest to plow. The peasants trudge miles each day to hoe or harvest the Lord's fields, and then work on their own scattered strips of oats, barley, or wheat in the different fields. Let's turn now to take a walk through the village. It isn't very big, but there's a lot going on. Here is the Lord's smithy, where the blacksmith pounds out iron tools over a fire. There's the Lord's mill, with a water wheel turned by a stream. In the mill, villagers are grinding grain into flour. There is the Lord's bakehouse, where all the bread is made, and there is a wine press and a brew house for making beer. And you can see a picture here of what a little village might look like. Like most manors, this one forms its own little world. It's isolated with the next manor or village many miles away, so it must produce just about everything the Lord and his people need to live. Meat and cheese for the table, sheep's wool for clothes, even beeswax for candles. The few items the Lord may need to buy from the outside world include iron for tools and salt for curing meat. The peasants' cottages huddle together near the stream. These small, smoky huts are made of timber, thatch, and mud. Many are homes to both people and their livestock, a cow or goat, chickens and sheep, and pigs. Only the lord of the manor has his own barns and stables near the big manor house where the lord and his family live. The manor house is made of stone and protected by a high wall. Along with the village church, the Lord's house is the center of manor life. Its great hall serves as a court. And here at special times, such as after the harvest or at Christmas time, the Lord may hold a village feast. If we could look in a window, we might see the high table where the Lord and his lady sit during a banquet, while servants scurry back and forth with plates of meat and jugs of wine. But the high wall shuts off the house from prying eyes. The Lord isn't at home today. He's out hunting, perhaps with his favorite hawk, which flies after rabbits and doves in the fields, or perhaps with his hounds, which chase deer and wild boar through his woodlands. What's that sound? It's the baying of hounds and approaching through the woods. The Lord of the manor is returning, so we'd best be on our way. The first castles probably appeared in northwestern France during the 9th century in response to frequent Viking attacks. They were made of timber and could be built quickly. Most stood on a mound of earth surrounded by timber walls in a deep ditch called a moat. Some moats held water diverted from a nearby river, but most were dry. Even a dry moat provided a tough challenge for an attacking force. The only access over the moat was a bridge, which could be drawn into the castle. Eventually, powerful lords began rebuilding their timber castles with stone, which was stronger and more fire resistant. Small towers spaced around the walls gave more protection from attacks, and anyone who wanted to cross the bridge had to pass through a gatehouse where watchful guards stood ready. And there's just another picture of maybe a feast. And here's an actual picture of a castle, and you can see the walls around it. Many castles boasted other defenses as well. Through slits high in the walls, archers could shoot arrows at attackers without venturing into the open. Enemies who made it past the arrows to the castle walls had better watch out. High above, jutting from the walls, there were overhangs with holes in the floors. Through these holes, defenders could drop stones or pour hot oil onto soldiers' heads. Assaulting armies came up with ingenious ways to attack stone castles. They built tall wooden towers, rolled them up to the walls, and jumped right over. They attacked with huge rock-hurling catapults. They tried knocking down doors with battering rams. But often the most effective way to take a castle was to lay siege to it. Castles were usually stocked with food, water, and weapons, but a long siege could starve the defenders into surrender. Some sieges lasted months or even years as each side tried to outlast the other. A castle wasn't necessarily a comfortable place to live. It could be a dark, dank, drafty home for a lord and his vassals. But in an age of raiders, bandits, and marauding armies, a castle offered something precious, a chance of safety. Those who labor, peasants and serfs. The lord of a manor provided land and security. In return, the peasants lived hard lives of service. 9 out of every 10 people in medieval Europe were peasants. That is, people who worked the land. Some were freemen who owned or leased their plots of land, but many were serfs. The serfs were peasants who were tied to the land they worked. They could not leave it without the lord's permission. Serfs spent part of their time in unpaid labor for the lord, sometimes as much as half of the work week. They plowed the fields and cut and stacked the hay and harvested the crops. If bad weather threatened, they had to gather in the lord's crops before their own. They threshed the grain, and in the surrounding woodlands, they gathered firewood and looked after grazing swine. Peasant women sometimes helped with all of these tasks in addition to completing their own duties. They spent long hours cooking and cleaning in the lord's kitchen, brewing beer, spinning wool, and churning butter. A medieval lawyer wrote a list of duties that one group of peasants owed their lord. They must wash and shear the lord's sheep for 3 days each summer. They must weed the lord's grain for 3 days and carry the hay for him. 4 times a year they must cart his grain to market. They must give him 40 eggs from their hens at Easter. In time left over from these tasks, the serf could work the ground the Lord had granted him. But if a serf sold vegetables from his own plot at market, the Lord claimed a share of the profits. He allowed the peasants to use his bakehouse and his mill, but he charged them a fee for the privilege. The life of a serf was not all drudgery. Seasonal fairs and festivals offered a break from the daily grind. When the weather was good, puppet shows made their way from village to village, or troops of dancers, musicians, jugglers, and acrobats toured the countryside. But nothing could hide the fact that serfs were tied to the manor and its lord. They weren't slaves, but they were little better off. After all, if they disobeyed the Lord, they could be turned off the manor, and then they might fall victim to starvation or bandits. If they were lucky and saved their money for years, peasants could buy their way out of serfdom by purchasing a small plot of land. But most who were born serfs died serfs. Free peasants who fell on hard times often ended up trading their freedom for serfdom, which meant years of toil on a manor they could not leave. Serfs lived lives of toil, struggling to feed their families and fulfill their duties to their lord. For many in Europe, all they had was a hope, like a flickering candle, sometimes strong and sometimes faint. A hope that life in a world to come would be better than the life they now lived. That's the reading of pages 538 to 541.